Hey folks, I want to talk to you about this application Readeo. I strongly recommend Readeo to help grandparents and parents read to their grandchildren remotely when they can't be in the same room. Whether you're living across the country, across the world, or you're just gone on a business trip, Readeo makes it easy for you to read to those young ones when you're away. It's a super easy tool that allows for video monitoring across the top of the screen so they can see you and you can see them, as well as having the book prominently displayed, making it easy for you to read to those young ones, or better yet, having them read to you. What I want you guys to do is go to cool-grandpa.us, look for the affiliate link for Readeo, click on that link, and sign up today for your free trial. Hey, welcome in. I'm glad you're here to join with me and Greg Vance to talk about his experience with being a grandfather. Now, Greg's got a unique perspective on his role as a grandfather in that he lives in the same neighborhood as his grandchildren. Now, what's great about this is that we're going to learn just what was going on in Greg's life leading up to finding out that he was going to become a grandfather. And we're going to learn how being a grandfather in the same neighborhood, how that works. Where are the boundaries with being the babysitter, but then also being grandfather? So without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Greg. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, Greg. Thank you so much for joining us on the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down and talk with us about your experience with being a grandfather.
Well, thanks, Greg. It's always great to meet yet another Greg and another grandfather.
Yeah, it'll keep the conversation simple for us. Although it'll be hard to say if I slip into third person or not. It'll be interesting.
Our listeners get confused. Which Greg is it?
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Now, Greg, I love hearing stories from grandfathers about their reaction to when the news was given to them that they were going to become a grandpa for the first time. Can you take us back to what that experience and what your reaction was?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So in my case, it probably wasn't as big a surprise, though it's always a surprise, right? Because you don't know, you know that the impending birth is coming. You don't know what day, but our daughter and son-in-law have been pretty open with us about, hey, in fact, we planned a trip together to go to London and to Scotland. And they kind of said, well, this is going to be the last big trip we have before we, start a family. And so we knew after that, there was probably going to be, X months after that before we had some news. So that was kind of delightful in that we had that time together to celebrate them before they started their family. And that was a terrific vacation we had together.
That is wild. That's the first time I've heard that scenario pop up. Because most of the time, similar to myself, it was, at Christmas or there's a dinner and then somebody slides a sonogram picture across the table or it's a, hey, mom, dad, sit down. We got some news for you. But that's interesting that they were planning that or had that, experience kind of lined up. But then also that they took advantage of having, hey, we know that our lives are going to change in a big and meaningful way. And let's do this trip and celebrate, not only what we have, but what's going to be coming. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it was all they're doing. That was their insightfulness to want to do that. And then, as you said, yeah, there is that time when you get to see the first ultrasound and things like that, which is just, that's a joyful time as well. And so, yeah, that was great.
Now, take me back. What was going on with your career at that time? Because I know you've transitioned from working for a Fortune 1000 company and you had a lot of things going on. Was this also part of that life change for you? In life change, meaning changing careers, finding a different motivation for work and life. Was this kind of mixed in with that?
It was definitely all mixed in with it. So if we think back, like you're saying, I left the corporate world a little over 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago, to start my own career coaching and business coaching practice. And my granddaughter is the oldest, is 4, and my grandson's 2. And so, yes, it was like right almost in the first third of that, all these changes that were coming, no longer commuting, working with people remotely. I do most of my work, maybe 95% of my coaching I do over Zoom or over phone calls. And so, and the big change for that as well is, now that my wife and I got to spend virtually 24 hours together a day. That's a big change after I was working countless hours, and just being home for what seemed like 7 or 8 hours at night. It seemed like.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, and where some of my head was at was that for a lot of us, and I'm painting with a broad brush, right? A lot of us that start to get into our late 40s, 50s, and so on, we're pretty much creatures of habit for the most part. We know when we want to get up and, let's say, we know when we get up and go to the gym, then we're going into the office, then I'm here for 8, 9, 10 hours a day. Then I'm going home. We have, we become these creatures of habit. And so this career change and life change that you had, and then thrown into the grandparent mode into it, that's a lot of change to be taking on for, I'm going to throw you into this, for guys our age.
Yeah, guys are, and then maybe we're more, analytical and things like that by nature. And, like, as we've talked with kind of our technical backgrounds, that we do a lot to be risk aware and manage risk and all that in life. But you're right. I think it was easier for me because I had just made that large change, and everything, I mean, literally everything was changed. How I worked, what my routine was, everything was just tossed out the window. So I was only, 3 years into that, 2 years into that when the news came. And so I like to think it was a pretty easy change. Plus, I've got my wife, her name's Sherry. I have her that was, as most moms would be, their grandmothers would be, they're over the top joyful about that and expectation. They start buying things, a year ahead of time, it seems like, before, anything that the child's going to need.
Oh, I absolutely get that. I think my wife and some of her girlfriends were out buying clothes and toys, and they're finding outfits that the grandkid couldn't possibly fit in for like at least another year and a half.
Exactly. Hopefully they're on sale.
Right. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
she was good with that, but yeah, it's interesting how I think grandmas versus grandpas react to that news. I don't know about you, but I was always, when I heard the news, I was very excited. Of course, we wanted to help the kids out with different things, but I was almost more in a planning, in a projecting into the future a little bit. I'm going to have a little buddy to take on roller coasters when we go to amusement parks. I'm going to have a little buddy to do, these types of different things. And so it's just kind of an interesting difference between, I think, grandmas and versus grandpas.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that, because it is, and this isn't meant to sound, I don't know if it fits in the sexist category or whatever, but you've got, especially in our case, with a mom and her daughter that's expecting, there is a different level of bonding on that. It's the next generation of mom and such versus a dad. We're important as well, but it doesn't seem like we're on the front lines necessarily during that process leading up to birth, and maybe even the first year or two, into it. And then I'd like to think, now that my grandson's 2 years old, my granddaughter's four, that's starting to turn a little bit, and I'm more becoming a lot. I'm trying to become much, much more involved, and so especially with my granddaughter and grandson. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was an interesting point too, because in my case, it's I've had two sons, and then we didn't have that scenario of having a daughter that was going through a pregnancy with my wife there. So there was a little bit of making sure that the daughter-in-laws had their moms and had those relationships, and we were kind of there, but we were even maybe a little bit further stepping back, not downplaying our roles and not being not supportive but understanding that sometimes, those daughters need their moms during that period. And that's part of that bonding, and that's part of that relationship that, if they're fortunate to have that is so very meaningful for them. And I think for granddads, that we need to recognize that we're not being pushed aside, but we have a different role to play during that period of a grandchild coming around and arriving. That we're there for support. We're there in support, meaning emotional support, sometimes financial support. But where we come into play is, to your point, is maybe a little bit further down the road. And that doesn't mean that we don't hold our grandsons, we don't hold our granddaughters, and we don't play around with them and things, but that relationship is a little bit different. Now, are your grandchildren living close to you, or how's that relationship?
Yeah, actually, we are so fortunate. They're within about 5 miles of us, and there were times this summer where they would be over maybe 4 to 5 days a week, either to stop
Wow.
by or to be here for 2, 3 hours, something like that. So it's what's fun about that is being able to incorporate them into everyday life. And so that's just a real blessing. And we've been really, we've just been really enthused by that, really thrilled by that.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's always interesting to me to hear about those kinds of relationships, because I always grew up away from my grandparents. No estrangement or anything like that. It was just, hey, my mom and dad first lived in Portland, Oregon, where my grandparents lived in Eastern Oregon. So that was like a 6-8 hour drive. And then we moved to Louisville, and then we moved to DC. So my experience was always kind of every few years I would see my grandfather, and there'd be these huge dramatic changes, just naturally growing up. I went from 8 years old. Next time I was seeing him, I was 11, or, however that worked.
Right.
So how does it work with them being so close with you guys? Do you guys have a whole set of grandma and grandpa toys at your place, or do they bring stuff over, or how does that work?
That's a really funny question. Yeah, actually, yes we do. And this comes into, I was going to mention this earlier, and I didn't see a place to put it back in, but so foolish grandpa, I went to my wife and I said, okay, so when the baby's here, we're going to have a budget, right? In order for clothes and toys and things like that. And my wife just looked at me and then she laughed.
Oh no. Oh no.
Sure.
Right.
Anyway, but yeah, but they definitely have, all their paraphernalia, all their toys and things here, diapers, both places, car seats everywhere. And so we're kind of fully outfitted to do things either place they're at. And then probably the fun part is, as with little kids, I'm sure you've seen this with, they get attached to small stuffed animals, and there'll be times they're either forgotten here, and there's this this big moment, big tragedy that somebody's got to run over here and get it. Or more often now, my granddaughter's starting to say, can, so and so, this animal sleep over at your house till we come back, 2 days from now. And it's like,
Mhm.
sure. And we'll do funny things with them and send them pictures and things like that.
That's interesting. I'd never thought about that, but you're right. I think even with my grandson, um, because my sons live in the same subdivision. I'm very lucky.
Oh, yeah.
They live up in Virginia, but I don't know, they ended up being in the same subdivision. So we see one, we see the other, and
Oh.
they sometimes will babysit each other's children and do different things. And those circumstances have come up where, that teddy bear or that narwhal or whatever the stuffed animal is it's not where it's supposed to be, and somebody can't go to sleep without that. And then, one or the other one's racing it over to the other house. So
Mm-hmm.
that's interesting.
Yeah, kind of to leap off on what you said a while ago, my grandparents were much more, they were in the same, let's say within 20 minutes of our home, but we were much more detached and didn't really do life so much the way that this is working out. And that's just an amazing situation for us to be fortunate.
So, Greg, what are some of the differences that you noticed now with being a grandfather, having the young kids around versus when you were a dad, a new dad, and your kids were young and kind of the same age? What are some of the things that you're noticing that you're doing differently this time around, interacting with those kids?
You're going to make me laugh through this podcast with these. These are great questions. So I've thought long and hard about, and my wife and I've talked about extensively about the role of a grandparent versus a parent, because I will say I can still step into parenting mode when obviously if I'm watching the two kids on my own, you kind of got to be the parent because their parents not there.
Right.
But when their parents are in the same room and there's this, and you're having dinner, it's not going well. There's a tendency to want to step in and be the parent again. And so it takes a lot for me to say, okay, you're not the parent, sit back, you're the grandparent, let them take care of it. And I have to mentally work through that every time. And so that's one for sure. And another one would be what's different is when you're a parent, you're under pressure to make sure you don't break your kids, when they're little, because you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
There's no manual for how to raise kids and all that, at least not a good manual. But now as a grandparent, you can sit back and do more observing and understanding more of just the curiosity they're showing and how they encounter new things, new tastes, doing new things outside. That's a lot of fun.
Yeah. And have you thought at all about how your life has changed, how you've gone into coaching? Obviously, there's a lot of books, there's a lot of people that you meet, different mindsets, some of those things. Have you noticed anything along those lines with how the interaction is going with the grandkids? Because I think when we're, let's say, 20s and 30s and we're thinking about career and we're heads down, to your point, we don't want to break the kids. Are we doing this right? Are we doing this wrong? Are we doing... But now I'm kind of curious with some of the materials and things that you've used to help educate yourself and then educate your clients. How does some of those, I don't know, lessons, let's say, come into play with your role as a grandfather?
Yeah, that's a interesting one that, again, my wife and I've talked about it extensively because she's involved in my, everything that I do in coaching, and by osmosis picks up a lot of those things. And so probably the two best things I can think about are, number one, I use a lot of personality assessments, and there's a bunch of them, but we'll just pick one for a second. and that is the DISC profile. And if you're familiar with that, it has 4 quadrants of traits. And so while you can't hand your hand your grandson or granddaughter, a computer or a tablet and say, here, fill this out, and they're going to get the answer out so you can
Right.
read it. You can work at a high level. And so I've done some just thinking about, okay, if I were to guess what their personality traits were based upon observing them and doing things with them and all that, that has been super helpful to think about which quadrant they fit in. And because of that, what are their personality hot buttons? The things that make them uncomfortable versus the things that make them really comfortable, things that help bring joy to them. And so that's been fun. And maybe the second one I might mention is if you've ever heard of Gary Chapman's 5 love languages,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
been around for a long time. And so trying to think about those too, those 5 gifts, and seeing how your grandkids just react to those, because you can just experiment with those, whether they're acts of gifts or service or whatever it may be. And in most cases, there's no cost to it, so
Right.
you can experiment and see what it is that really helps elevate them, personally.
Oh, that's great, because the other thing too is they're so fluid at that stage as well, because
Mm-hmm.
it's all experimental, right? The world's brand new, literally brand new. And it's interesting though to use that education that you have to also figure out how um, to interact with them, and also the way things are with even discipline to an extent. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously grandparents need to be grandparents and parents are parents, but when we're babysitting and we're doing some other things, kind of picking up on the cues about how devastating is taking the teddy bear away versus doing something else, a
Mm-hmm.
timeout, or where those course corrections come into play.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Exactly.
how how has the interaction been uh, with Sam and your daughter, with being so close to you guys? Do you intentionally set up some boundaries, or have you guys set up some boundaries between um, making sure that it's almost like the everybody loves Raymond, so the pop-ins don't happen. It's we're over here to fix you guys breakfast, or we're over here to do these things. How has that relationship with your daughter and son-in-law worked out?
Yes, I think the way we've approached it is we kind of use the same set of rules or boundaries we would whether they live 20 minutes away or they lived just 5 minutes away almost, well, 10 minutes away. And so that's just helpful. They do drop by occasionally. We might drop by occasionally on them, but we don't do it all the time. We try and respect them as a family and their privacy, and they do the same for us, because you're right, it could get pretty hairy, kind of mixing it up and sending everybody a little bit off of their normal schedules without some warning. And I will say that my wife and I are pretty regimented with our days, and we do plan things and all that. So I guess that's another lesson we've learned, is that there can be days that you've got things planned out well, but you got to have plan B in case someone calls and say, hey, do you want to go to the playground, go to X, Y, or Z, go swimming or something like that. And so there's a little bit more flexibility and fluidity in there, but we still use the get in touch and ask for a system.
Oh, sure, sure. And that it's important, I think, too, to recognize everybody's different boundaries, because certainly,
Mm-hmm.
as whether it's a daughter-in-law or son-in-law, or just understanding that they're a young family that's trying to put things together. And as much as it's great to go in and, hey, I was in the neighborhood, I grabbed a Slurpee at 7-Eleven, I thought I'd stop in and say hi. It can be disruptive if they're trying to do something with the kids that, it's not on the Google Calendar that you have access to, or something along those lines.
Exactly. Yeah, you just upset the entire dinner plan or something, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it just also allows them that space to be that family. And it's not that you aren't a family, but hey, it's important that they have boundaries as well as for you guys, right? Because, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if they just showed up and said, hey, here's the grandchildren, as much as you love them, you might have a coaching call in 15 minutes and you might not be able to there's a little bit of like, how am I going to watch the grandkids and do a coaching call? So
Yeah, that's funny you should mention that. That's happened.
yeah,
You
I
have this
bet.
collision, and it's like, okay, plan B, plan C.
Right.
You got to have a way through it, but we work it out.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Another question I had for you was being so close, and I know the grandchildren are 4 and 2, so it's not exactly as being 12 and 10. But do you find time where it can be just grandpa granddaughter time, or do you find
Mm.
ways where you can make something a little bit more special, let's say, than a typical day of going over to grandpa and grandma's so they can watch us?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, we've had that come up now that my granddaughter is in preschool. My grandson will come over by himself because it gives my daughter some away time from both kids. But that's been, as you were saying there, it's been particularly enjoyable because then it's just one on one with my grandson or with my grandson and my wife, and yeah, that's a set of different dynamics because now you can really focus and concentrate and just say, we're going to do exactly what you want to do. You want to lay on the floor and play with cars. We're going to build something, whatever out of blocks, whatever we're going to do. And you can definitely see a different change, and the dynamics change tremendously.
Yeah, and because I think when I'm talking with adult, uh, I don't know, adult grandkids or adults that have memories of their grandfathers, there's always those special moments, and sometimes those moments aren't really planned out. It's, hey, we were shooting baskets in the backyard, but I remember that's the time when me and grandpa could talk about what's going on in middle school or these
Yeah,
different types of things. So it's interesting to watch how that evolves because I'm getting close to that myself with a 3.5-year-old in 1.5-year-old. I've got a ways to go for the youngest one, but that 3.5 year
sure.
old, they're finally getting to the point where, hey, grandpa and my grandson we can start to go for a walk here and there, a short walk,
Mm-hmm.
but start to build up, time where Kent Julian was on and was talking about uh, you never know when it's going to be quality time versus quantity time.
True.
Because it's the grandkids or it's the receivers, it's the person receiving that time gets to decide if that's quality time or not.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
again,
love that.
it's shooting baskets, right? It's 20 times it's going to be just shooting baskets and hanging out, but there's going to be one time where there's an important life discussion that goes on, and all of a sudden, boom, that's quality, or that's quality time. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're spot on. We've got, you know, a few acres here, and so we can go outside and be in nature and all that. And especially for my granddaughter, just because she's older and starting to think through about, plants and animals and things like that. And there's plenty of discussions that come up around God and faith and creation and things like that that are fun to watch those questions and to be able to give her some, the best answers that I can, and give, in this case, give her a faith perspective.
oh, sure, because I think it's one of those things too that in talking to different people about different spiritual discussions and faith walks, is that grandfathers and grandmas too can play an important role in that because they're not mom and dad,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that the grandson and granddaughter are going to services with mom and dad. There's kind of an expectation of, if I ask a question, I know what mom and dad are going to say, but maybe grandpa has a little bit of a different, take on things, or maybe I get a different answer, or it may even be that, hey, especially when families get more kids coming along, I can get some attention for something that feels very important to me, especially along spiritual matters. So that's great that's starting to become a little bit of a, I don't know, it's probably too young to be a habit, but something where it's laying groundwork. So as she gets to be 6 and 7, and even goes further down that line of like, wait a second, this doesn't quite make sense, Grandpa. How does this fit into the world, and how does this fit into our lives?
Exactly. Yeah, and there's kind of what you're talking about there as far as some of that special time together. Though we did it together, I said, hey, you guys want to do a science experiment? It was below freezing out there, and I said, I'm going to have you fill these cups of water up. We're going to put them outside, then we're going to go in and play for a while and see how long it takes for them to freeze outside. And they're like, what? The water's going to freeze?
Yeah. So. That's interesting to think about, because for them, ice just comes out of the refrigerator or the freezer, right? It's just, It's always there. Like, I don't know how ice is made. What do you mean? We put water in and then it freezes, and yeah.
How fun. The simple things we forget, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of those joys where it's like, I think as grandparents, we can sit back because we don't have the same daily pressures as parents and go, wow, okay, that's kind of an interesting little take on things. The discovery with the little grandkids about, hey, where are the ants in the sidewalk going and what are they doing? I think when we're in our 20s and 30s, we're just, okay, let's just keep walking. The looking down at the ants and trying to puzzle out what they're doing and what their life is something, that we don't have patience for. But as grandparents with a little bit more mileage on us, we can go, oh yeah, that is kind of fascinating, the way that they make those trails and they do those things.
Yes.
Well, Greg, we've had you on for a good little while here, and I do appreciate your time. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that maybe I haven't brought up in regards to grandparenting?
Well, I think, part of this is when you're this contrast, and you just mentioned it, kind of touched upon it there. When you're a parent, I remember that time seeming like it goes so slowly, day to day, no, not lots of sleep. You feel like you're just going to wear out and not make it to the next day because it's so far away. But when you're a grandparent, and this is a natural life thing, the time seems to be passing more quickly. And so when I think about setting some, maybe as you were talking about a few minutes ago, some goals for maybe some experiences I could have with my grandson or my granddaughter, it seems like they're far off, but they're not that far off. They're coming pretty quick. And so that I sit down, and I was thinking today about, okay, what are some really fun things that I could plan out 2-3 years from now that I need to start getting ready for now? And so I guess that would be, what I would say to people as a good takeaway is, be thinking well ahead of time of the ways that you can impact your grandkids, because it's going to be there. The opportunity is going to be there before you know it, and you may not be prepared. So be prepared.
Oh, that's great advice. And I love that, because it's not only, I think, preparing for the moment or the experience, but we always know too is that sometimes there's a financial piece of that pie. And so to your point, it's, I've thought about, hey, I'd like to do a road trip with my grandson when he gets older, with all the kids, to have maybe some one-on-one, and maybe we do a cross-country road trip during the summer, right? Well, that's going to be time, gas, So for grandfathers, just to tag on to that point is, hey, if we need to start thinking a little bit of whether it's Disneyland or something else, budgeting out some of those experiences and doing it early enough so we don't get into that crunch and we have regrets as far as we didn't have the time, we didn't have the means, whatever that might be. So great advice.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now, one thing I just definitely want to thank you for being on here, and just have really appreciated the time, and this has been great. So thank you, Greg, for all your patience and for all the wisdom that you've shared with our group. I appreciate that.
Very welcome. That was a blast. Thanks, Greg.
What a cool conversation with Greg. I hope you really enjoyed this conversation, because there's a couple of things that were really unique about Greg's path so far with being a grandfather. One is the fact that they were on a trip to Scotland and in England, and his daughter and son-in-law expressed that, hey, this is probably the last big trip we're going to be able to go on for a while, because we're going to be starting our family soon. What a unique experience being part of that conversation, and part of, what a big life change that is when you start to have kids, and all the changes that go on. The other part too that was pretty unique was hearing about Greg's experience with being a grandfather in the same subdivision as grandkids. What boundaries, how does the relationship work? How does time away from each other work? All very interesting and fascinating. So if you've liked this conversation, please be sure to share it with a friend. The other thing too is be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast if you're hearing this for the first time. So until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.